So our last lecture on fingerprints is talking about specific types of fingerprints as far as what you could find at a crime scene. So there are three types of fingerprints you could potentially find and locate at a crime scene: patent, plastic, and latent. So a little bit of information on those. A patent fingerprint is a fingerprint that's left behind in some type of colored liquid or substance. So it's visible by just looking at it because the finger has been coated in some type of colored substance like blood or ink, and then that person has touched another surface and left a print behind in a colored material. So three good examples of fingerprints can be shown here. Plastic fingerprints are fingerprints that are almost three-dimensional or like an indentation because they're produced when a finger comes into contact with a soft surface. So these aren't as common to find at crime scenes because there's not necessarily soft substances lying around, but maybe there's mud or dirt that someone's put their hand in. Maybe there's putty around a windowsill that's been warmed up by the sun and kind of soft. So think about when you were younger and maybe you had silly putty and you put your fingerprint in it. That's exactly what a plastic fingerprint is. The unique thing about plastic fingerprints is if you wanted to copy somebody's fingerprint, you could by doing it this way. So in this picture here, we have someone putting their fingerprint into a soft substance. This is then hardening. It's like a jelly material. The person then pours in another gel material, lets it harden, and they lift this little piece out, and that piece contains a person's fingerprint. So you could potentially wear that on your finger and have someone else's fingerprint, which people have done before. And then the last type of fingerprint is probably the most common type of fingerprint, not only at crime scenes, but just in general. It's called a latent fingerprint. A latent fingerprint is concealed. So you cannot see this with your naked eye. You have to actually develop it and make it visible by either dusting with a powder or fuming it. Latent fingerprints form because of the oils that secrete from your skin, from your pores. So every moment you're leaving latent fingerprints behind on your desk, on your pencil, whatever it may be, but you can't see them. So if I dusted my classroom, there would be thousands of overlapping fingerprints to be found. But you can't see these until you develop them. So about 20% of the fingerprints, if you will, that are found at a crime scene actually come from the palm side of the hand, the little finger to the wrist. So look at your hand, your pinky finger down to where your wrist bends, the very left side of that. That's because think about when you're sitting. If you put your hands on your desk right now, that's the side of your hands that's touching everything. So these are two pictures of latent fingerprints after they've been developed. So notice they've applied black powder to bring them out. Until they did that, you cannot see these. And that's usually what criminals forget, is unless you have gloves on, you're constantly leaving latent prints behind. So how do we actually collect these various types of prints? The first collection method is dusting. So you can dust with powders used to produce latent prints. Patent prints are already visible, and plastic prints are usually visible just because of an indentation. So this is used for latent prints. Basically, you dust with a powder that's colored, and it adheres to the oil residue left behind on the surface of the object, and it sticks to the residue left by your fingerprint, and that pattern is visible. So black powder is the most common type of powder we use. It's used for white or light surfaces. So if you were in class, we would dust on paper, and black powder is just made out of charcoal. Gray powder is another type. It's made out of aluminum, and this is good for dark surfaces or shiny surfaces like a glass or a mirror. Magnetic powder is relatively new. It's pretty fancy. It's either black or gray, usually iron-based because iron is magnetic. When you're dusting with magnetic powder, it's a different style of dusting than any other one. You actually don't come into contact with the object you're dusting at all. You just kind of hover this brush, which is a magnet, and this is the iron filing sticking to the magnet. Kind of just hover it over top of the fingerprint. And this is a nice type of dusting. You could use it for anything, but especially on rough surfaces. This is nice because you don't want to smudge the fingerprint when you're trying to dust on a rough surface, getting into grooves and things like that. Fluorescent powder is also nice if you're having problems finding fingerprints or they're very smudged. Fluorescent powder is usually blue or orange or green, very bright color, and you dust with it so you can see it, but then you put a UV light on it and it becomes very bright. It depends on the situation and the type of object being dusted. The other type of collection method for latent prints is fuming. So fuming is when you have a vapor forming from some type of liquid or gas, and it comes into contact with the surface of the object. It comes into contact with those oils and kind of sticks to it and develops and becomes visible. Because remember, latent prints are invisible until developed. So iodine fuming is the oldest method. Iodine is a very hazardous gas, so it is dangerous, but it's the oldest method. It worked for the best for what they had. Basically, take an iron crystal in the solid form, you put it into a heater contraption like shown here. You put in the object you're trying to develop the prints on, so in this case it was a piece of paper, and then you crank up the heat. So basically the iodine crystal sublimates, it turns to a gas. That gaseous vapor sticks to the paper. Specifically, it sticks to the oils, and then it leaves behind a visible print. So just like someone inking their hand and fingerprints, it appears. The problem with this is it's not permanent. So over time, that iodine, the purple color, the brownish color will start to fade. So that's why they kind of got away from it. Not only was it kind of hazardous, but it doesn't last forever, which isn't good if you're working with cold cases. Anhydrine is another type of fuming technique. It involves a liquid. So basically you spray anhydrine onto surfaces, and it has a bluish purplish color, and it does the same style. It reacts with amino acids left behind by your skin, by your sweat, and makes the prints visible. So you spray this onto porous surfaces, very good for porous surfaces. It will absorb into places where it's not needed. So the paper that's still white, it just absorbed into that. But the places where there were fingerprints and sweat left behind, it actually stuck to it and then developed into a purpley blue color. And this is a relatively quick result. Within an hour or two, you'll get nice developed dark prints. A physical developer is also a popular method in the past, but it's not used as widely right now. Physical developer requires silver nitrate, which is a dangerous chemical to be using. It is a liquid and it has like a brownish color to it. So the development will be dark brown, almost black looking. The only time they really use a physical developer is if every other method they've tried didn't work. Or if there's something that got wet and you're trying to print it, sometimes physical developer will get it out because it's such a harsh chemical. The bad thing about using silver nitrate or a physical developer is it will wash away any traces of proteins. So if you're trying to extract DNA from an object and there's also fingerprints on it you need to develop, you want to make sure you handle the DNA first and then use a physical developer. Because if you do it opposite, the physical developer will destroy the proteins and that DNA evidence is gone forever. The most common technique is superglue fuming. This is best for non-porous surfaces, so not absorbent surfaces. You use superglue, truly a chemical in superglue, along with sodium hydroxide, and you get this vapor that forms in the chamber, and the fumes from that chemical reaction stick to the fingerprint, the oils, and it appears a white crystally color. So you get something that looks like this. So it makes it very visible and very clear. And it's also cheap. The chemicals aren't expensive and they're not as hazardous as some of the other ones. So you don't have to know this chart, but just if you are interested, it shows you the main types of fuming. So anhydrine, this is superglue fuming. This is the main ingredient in superglue. Silver nitrate, which is the physical developer, and then iodine fuming, the oldest type. And it kind of just goes through when's the best type of object to use it from, how do you apply it, some of the safety, and then what actually happens and what color to expect. So it's something interesting to actually look at when you have time, just to get a little bit more information. So now that we've developed our fingerprints using either dusting or fuming, how do we preserve them? So once you develop a latent print, either by dusting or fuming, you want to make sure you permanently preserve it. Because what if you need to pull it out for evidence for trial or it's a cold case? So there's many options. The first is just to photograph it. So you develop it, it's now visible, you take a picture of it. That picture gets submitted to evidence, and if it's a big object like a car door or something, you don't necessarily want to keep that. So you can just photograph it and keep the photo of that fingerprint. It can also be scanned later. If it's small enough, if the object is small enough, you can cover it and make a chamber and fume, or you can lift the print. So powder is applied first if you're dusting, and then you lift it with fingerprint tape. So you apply the powder down, you develop the print, it's now covered in powder, and that powder makes the fingerprint visible, and then you just apply tape and you lift it. So the fingerprint with the powder comes off of that object and is now on the tape, and then you tape it to an evidence marker, an evidence paper. So you tape it to something with a good contrast, and now you have that fingerprint permanently reserved, and it's no longer on this object. You don't have to worry about keeping this object, you only have to worry about keeping the small fingerprint. If it's fuming, you would fume it first, and then you could do the same thing. You could lift it with tape or just photograph it. All right, last is the ACE-V process. So it's an acronym for a 4-step process. A stands for analysis or analyze. So when you're actually looking at fingerprints to determine if it's a match to somebody else's, you require a fingerprint examiner. So analysis is whenever the examiner actually identifies, is this fingerprint actually usable? Is there any distortions to the friction ridges, major scarring, anything that could impinge the print's appearance and make it not usable? So the first step is just, is this print actually worth our time to continue to develop, to process, to use for evidence? If yes, it is an adequate fingerprint, it will be sent to the next stage, which is the C stage. C stands for comparison. Comparison requires 3 different levels. So level 1, the examiner is going to look at the general ridge flow and the general pattern. So for example, say it's a loop and you have all whorls. The fingerprint examiner can say, well, it can't be from your hands because you don't have a loop. You have all whorls. So that's the first step, is just a general pattern, loop, arch, whorl. The second step, they compare the actual ridge characteristics. So they zoom in and they start looking at ridge characteristics and they determine a yes or no for, is this a match? The third step is they zoom in even more to even more specific tiny characteristics, and they actually look at the pores, the ridges, where the pores are placed, any breaks in ridges, creases, scarring, any other permanent minute details that could say, yes, this is this person's print, or no. So after comparison, it goes on to the evaluation stage, and there's 3 possible decisions. So they're going to compare this print that they've just examined to a known person's. 3 options, 3 results. The first result could be identification. The print you've been looking at is the exact same print as the person you're looking at. So there's a direct match. It is identified as coming from this source. The second option is exclusion, where you can say, no, this print does not match this person. It did not come from that source. And the third option, which unfortunately does happen sometimes, is inconclusive, meaning that unfortunately there wasn't enough evidence in these characteristics to say yes or no. They can't say yes, it did come from this person, but they also can't say no, it didn't. So that does happen sometimes, unfortunately, especially if you pick up a partial print or smudged print from a crime scene. The last step is verification. So whatever the evaluation came to, identification or inconclusive or no match or whatever it may be, another examiner has to agree to that. So they'll do the same process again, starting with the C comparison, and then hopefully they come to the same conclusion as the previous person did. But if they didn't, they have to restart or get somebody else. So you have to have two examiners come to the same agreement on the conclusion. Yes, it is a match. No, it is not a match, or we can't tell. So just a quick video to show you how super glue fuming happens, since you can't actually be in lab to see it. So there's a zoomed in picture of what she got. So like I said, she went from having invisible fingerprints that you couldn't see. She fumed for it first. Sometimes fuming's enough, you can lift from there. But she went ahead and also dusted to bring out the print even more. Then she showed you the process of actually lifting it with tape. You have to be careful when lifting. You don't want to obviously put your own fingerprints on anything. She had gloves on. And then as far as using lifting tape, you just have to make sure you're working as she did from one side to the next, and just smoothing it out as you go, because you could potentially corrupt and ruin that fingerprint by incorrect methods, and then that would be completely lost forever. All right, the next video is actually a video on dusting. Oh, I guess I don't have dusting anymore. Well, dusting, as she showed you, you just apply a little bit of powder, be very careful, it's almost a very light touch, and then once you have that developed print, you would lift it just as she did. So that is the end of the chapter on fingerprints.